You know Naughty Dog? Of course you do. How can you not recognize the creators of The Last of Us, The Last of Us Left Behind, The Last of Us Remastered, The Last of Us Part 2, The Last of Us Part 1 Remake, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, and The Last of Us Complete. Jokes aside, Naughty Dog is widely considered one of the best PlayStation developers ever. Maybe not number one, but absolutely in the top 10. And honestly, that reputation didn't come out of nowhere. On almost every PlayStation home console, they've defined an entire era. Crash Bandicoot on PS1, Jak and Daxter on PS2, Uncharted on PS3, and The Last of Us on PS4, kinda. Almost every game they've made is beloved. You can say Jak is more of a cult classic, or that The Last of Us Part 2 is divisive, and that's fair. But even then, Naughty Dog's lineup is impressive. With Naughty Dog turning 40 years old and Crash Bandicoot turning 30, I figured it was the perfect time to do a Crash Bandicoot retrospective. But when you do the math, you realize that Naughty Dog existed for 10 years before Crash Bandicoot was born. Which means Crash wasn't their first game, not even close. Before reviewing the Crash series, I wanted to make one video about that forgotten era. The games Naughty Dog made before anyone knew who they were. Because this is a part of their history almost nobody talks about. I'm talking about 6 games. Math Jam, an educational Apple II game, an unfortunately lost media, Crazed, a sports game, Dream Zone, a point-and-click adventure game, Keef the Thief, an action RPG, Rings of Power, an RPG on the Sega Genesis, and Way of the Warrior, a digitized fighting game on the 3DO. This isn't a situation like Insomniac, where there's basically one game before Spyro. Naughty Dog had a whole decade of experimentation across genres, platforms, and ideas. So before we spin into Crash Bandicoot, let's go back and see where Naughty Dog really come from, and whether these games deserve to be forgotten or not. Before Crash Bandicoot, before Naughty Dog was even called Naughty Dog, this whole thing starts with 2 kids. Back in the early 1980s, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin met when they were about 12 years old in school, and instead of paying attention, they were sitting together talking about video games. But they weren't just playing games, they were already making them. Both of them had Apple II computers. Andy had already been programming for a couple of years, and Jason was making little games too, mostly focusing on art and animation. When they checked out each other's stuff, the 2 boys almost immediately learned that their individual skills could fill in each other's weakness, so their friendship and subsequent partnership began. And that partnership formed the blueprint for Naughty Dog. Andy handled the code and math stuff, Jason handled the art and visuals. That exact split would carry through pretty much their entire early career. What's also really important here is the time period. This was before the internet. No Google, no YouTube tutorials, no Stack Overflow. If something broke, you couldn't just look it up. If they needed help, they had to go to Apple user group meetings, dig through thick computer books, or straight up call random industry people and hope someone answered. And honestly, that worked in their favor. If you knew how to program at all in the early 80s, you already had a massive advantage. Solving impossible problems became normal for them, and that skill stuck. At one point, instead of making an original game, they dedicated to do something absolutely unhinged. They tried to straight up copy Nintendo's Punch-Out. Not inspired by it, not similar to it. No, they literally recreated it character by character. They filmed the arcade machine frame by frame and spent about a year rebuilding the whole thing on Apple II. And somehow it actually worked. According to Andy, it was pretty good. But the project never saw the light of day anyway. Because in 1984, they made a mistake. They they accidentally overwrote the only copy of the game while trying to back it up. After that disaster, they decided to finally make something original, and that became Math Jam. They didn't immediately call themselves Naughty Dog. At first they were named Jam, which stood for Jason and Andy's Magic. And yes, they officially incorporated the company in 1984 when they were 14 years old, which is insane. Math Jam was an educational, just like many Apple II games. Inspired in part by a connection to a teacher working with disadvantaged children. The game featured a friendly character designed to help teach basic arithmetic, turning math problems into a simple interactive experience. Like many early indie developers, Rubin and Gavin self-published the game. They copied it onto floppy disks, photocopied the instructions, and packaged everything in Ziploc bags. In 1985, they began selling Math Jam directly to schools. And for two teenagers, that alone was a huge win. But once they tried to expand, reality hit. Schools wanted official approvals like signatures from teachers and psychiatrists before they'd buy more copies. That was a lot to ask from a couple of 15-year-olds. Still, Math Jam did exactly what it needed to do. It proved that Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin could actually finish a game, sell it, and run a real company. And with that confidence, they were finally ready to move on from educational games and take the first real steps toward becoming Naughty Dog. After Math Jam, they knew one thing for sure. They didn't want to keep making educational games forever. So for their next project, they decided to make a real video game. That game would eventually be called Ski Crazed, but originally it was named Ski Stud. This was around 1986, and at this point, Jason and Andy were about 16 years old. The vibes they were going for with was very much mid-80s ski movie energy. Something like Hot Dog the movie. You'd ski down the mountain, show off, and quote, pick up chicks and hang out in hot tubs. Jason originally programmed the game in BASIC. It technically worked, but it had a big problem. It was painfully slow. As you went down the hill, the game would actually slow down more and more, which kinda defeats the whole point of a downhill skiing game. So Andy stepped in and rewrote the whole thing in assembly language. Once it was rewritten, the game finally felt fast, responsive, and playable. This was one of the first times their teamwork really clicked in a serious way. Jason prototyped ideas, Andy coming in and making them actually run properly. But one of the wildest parts of Ski Crazed development wasn't the code, it was the art tools. Back then, paint programs on Apple II were awful. There was no Photoshop, no mouse, and no proper pixel editors. So Jason did something completely unhinged. He used Pinball Construction Set, a pinball game maker, to create art for their game because unlike the paint programs of the time, it had a pixel editor. Using a terrible touchpad and a tiny section of a CRT screen, Jason would draw art pixel by pixel, fighting against constant jitter. Every single line was a nightmare, and it somehow got worse. You actually couldn't save the art in a usable way. To get the graphics out of Pinball Construction Set and into their game, they had to hard reset the Apple II, catching the image data as it dumped into memory, and then manually extract what they needed. They did this over and over again, resetting the computer constantly just to steal their own artwork. This kind of problem solving became normal for them. They weren't given proper tools, so they just forced existing ones to do things they were never meant to do. They pitched Ski Stud to a small publisher called Budville. It wasn't a big company, maybe a few dozen employees, but they were interested in publishing it on the condition of changing the name time to Ski Crazed. So yeah, the development of this game really shows how courageous and creative Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin were. I genuinely respect them and the game they made. But respecting a game doesn't mean I have to love it or even like it. The problem here isn't the developers. It's the platform the game was made for and the era it came out in. By the standards of the Apple II and the 80s, Ski Crazed is a solid game. But by today's standards, or even by the standards of the 2000s when I was a kid, it's about as basic as a video game can possibly be. When you boot it up, you get 5 options. Take lessons, make a slope, slalom practice, play the game, and choose slopes. Take lessons is basically the tutorial. The main goal in every level is simple: ski down the slope and survive the hazards. The controls are extremely minimal. You don't press buttons at all. You only move the joystick up or down. Some hazards require you to push the joystick up, others require you to pull it down. That's it. There are warning signs that tell you a dangerous section is coming up, and some hazards make you jump. Most jumps are safe unless there is ice right after them. In that case, you need to hold the joystick in the correct direction while you're in the air to clear it. Ice is completely safe as long as you don't jump on it. And honestly, that's the entire game. Make a slope is a simple level editor, and choose slopes lets you play the ones you made. The main game has 15 levels. You can mess up a few times before losing a life. But if you lose enough lives, it is a game over and you've sent all the way back to level 1. One thing that confused me at first is that when you fail a hazard, you don't need to redo it. You immediately move to the next one. I didn't realize this early on and kept failing the same section over and over again, which made the game way harder than it needed to be. I reached level 14 a few times, but kept dying at its beginning. I could have replayed the game and beaten it, but once you've cleared the first few levels, you've basically seen everything the game has to offer, so I didn't really feel the need to. Slalom practice lets you play levels 5 and 10, but with one big difference: you die in a single hit. You could call it a challenge mode. At first it felt impossible, but after dying over and over again, I got surprisingly good at it. By the end, those 2 levels became almost pathetically easy. Beating slalom practice also makes the main game more forgiving. If you mess up on levels 5 or 10, the game just lets you continue to the next level instead of punishing you. Most of the challenge in Ski Crazed comes from the limitations of the time. If you think going to 30 FPS is painful, then playing this game might feel like actual torture. Even to me, a person who enjoys games running at even 15 FPS, the animation here is rough. It's so choppy that I had to start predicting hazards instead of reacting to them. Thankfully, the game is forgiving in one important way. You don't have to move the joystick at the exact moment you hit a hazard. You can hold the correct direction before reaching it, and as long as you're not holding the wrong input, you'll be fine. At first, I emulated the joystick with a keyboard, but later levels became stressful and I kept hitting the wrong keys out of panic. So I switched to a PS5 controller, which is funny for 2 reasons. First, it has a ridiculous number of buttons that I never once needed, and second, I was using a modern controller designed for games that almost look like real life to play something that in both animation and depth feels like a Color Tiger Electronics LCD game. I did enjoy Ski Crazed a little because I tried to put myself in the mindset of 80s kids. I also genuinely tried to find something to appreciate in all games, especially ones with historical value. But despite how easy it is to emulate, I wouldn't recommend this to most people today. I respect Ski Crazed just purely for legacy reasons. Released in 1987, Ski Crazed became Jam's first proper commercial game. It didn't sell a ton, about 1500 copies, earning them roughly $2 per copy, but that was still real money for two teenagers. Crazed was a massive step forward. It proved they could work with a publisher, ship a real arcade-style game, and survive in an industry that was starting to recover from the video game crash. And with that experience under their belt, Jason and Andy were ready to take the next step forward in their careers, crafting a trio of games quite unlike Math Jam, Crazed, or anything they created before. By the time Crazed shipped, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin weren't rich or anything, but at 16 years old they were doing pretty well. They had worked with a real publisher, made some money, and most importantly, proven they weren't just lucky. For their next game, they stayed with the same publisher and started working on a much more ambitious project called Dream Zone, which released in 1987. Unlike Crazed, which was very arcade focused, Dream Zone was meant to be a point and click adventure game. It leaned way more into exploration and ideas, with text heavy storytelling mixed with graphics that were actually pretty advanced for the time. In fact, Dream Zone was the first game they made that didn't only run on the Apple II. It was also released on the Commodore Amiga, Microsoft DOS, and Atari ST, which was a big deal for them. Supporting more platforms forced them to think more seriously about portability and structure, stuff that would matter a lot later in their careers. The premise was exactly what the title suggests. You play as a kid who falls into a bizarre dream world. The game opens with a visual trick inspired by The Wizard of Oz. The real world is shown using black and white digitized graphics, and once you enter the dream, everything switches to full color, with Jason's hand-drawn art taking over. Development-wise, Dream Zone was a huge step up in complexity. Between the text-heavy structure, the adventure game logic, the cross-platform release, and the experimental visuals, this was the most ambitious thing they'd attempt so far. When you start Dream Zone, the first thing you hear is a really nice piece of music composed by Sarah Sidman. Right away, the game makes a good first impression. We begin in a teenager's bedroom, and at first, everything is shown in black and white. The screen is absolutely packed with UI elements. At the very top, there's a menu bar where you can save and load the game. Below that is the main picture area, which shows what the protagonist is currently seeing. Next to it is a control pad that lets you move in 4 directions, as well as going up and down. Under that, there's a display line split into 2 sections. The upper part is divided into 3 parts. On the left, you see the names of your companions. In the middle, the name of your current location. And on the right, the direction you're viewing the area from. The lower part contains the command buttons. You've got commands like inventory, look, get, drop, talk, give, use, buy, hit, and open. All pretty self-explanatory. You click a command, then click something in the picture area to apply it. Below that is the description window where all the text appears. Narration, dialogue, hints, and everything else. And finally, at the very bottom, there's a command line where you can manually type commands instead of using the buttons. The command line is actually necessary because some actions don't have buttons. For example, you have to type commands like sleep, shoot, and ask. After sleeping, you wake up in a dream zone, and suddenly the game switches to full color. I ended up at the station, tried to enter a bar, and was immediately blocked because the protagonist is underage. You can get a fake ID, but first you need some papers. And this is where I realized something very important. This is a troll game. A huge portion of the early game takes place inside one building where you endlessly move from room to room just to get that one required item. This took me an hour, and it wasn't challenging in a clever way. It wasn't about solving interesting puzzles or using logic. It was purely a test of endurance and patience. I'm a patient person, so I pushed through it, but I didn't enjoy it. The game is clearly trying to be comedic, but at that point, it felt like the joke was on me for wasting my time. Eventually, I got the fake ID, entered the bar, did a few small tasks. After that, I reached a carnival, and that's where the game started crashing on me repeatedly. I think the emulator was struggling with the second floppy disk. I could have looked for another version or tried to troubleshoot it further, but honestly, I didn't feel motivated to. Nothing up to that point made me excited to see what happens next. Maybe there's a great story moment later on, but if that's the case, the game failed at its job. It didn't keep me engaged enough to want to continue. Unlike their earlier games, Dream Zone actually sold very well. The game sold over 10,000 copies, earning them around $15,000. For a couple of 70-year-olds still in high school, that was an insane level of success. But instead of being satisfied, it made them restless. They started to realize that Battlefield was holding them back. The publisher was small, didn't market the game very well, and didn't have strong distribution. Dream Zone wasn't showing up everywhere it could have, and Jason and Andy noticed. They even visited Battlefield and quickly realized the company wasn't exactly ambitious. Jason joked that one of the partners gave off heavy mellow stoner energy. Not exactly the vibe you want if you believe you're destined to be the biggest studio in the industry. Both Jason and Andy have said that even at this early stage, they felt like they were meant to do something bigger. If a publisher wasn't good enough, then clearly the solution was to find a better one. This mindset that nothing should stand in the way of what they wanted to build would become a recurring theme throughout Naughty Dog's history. So by the end of Dream Zone, they had shipped a successful adventure game, proven they could work across multiple platforms, outgrown their first publisher, and they were ready to cut ties and aim higher. Next up, they take that ambition and channel it into something even more complex, an action RPG called Keef the Thief. After Dream Zone, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin were feeling unstoppable. They were still teenagers, but they had 3 games under their belt. Instead of slowly climbing the ladder, they decided to make the boldest move they'd ever made. They called Electronic Arts. No agent, no connections, just two 17-year-olds calling EA and straight up asking for a publishing deal. And somehow it worked. They got put through to actual decision makers at the company. EA asked to see what they'd done, so Jason and Andy mailed them a copy of Dream Zone. EA liked what they saw. According to Andy, the response was basically, yeah, this looks good, we'll send you a contract. That is insane. They asked EA for $15,000 to make their next game, which sounds laughable now, but at the time felt reasonable. On top of that, EA offered them 10% royalties per copy sold. This was the era when EA really leaned into the idea of electronic artists, thanks to the founder, Trip Hawkins. And they actually treated developers like creative stars. The problem was that $15,000 wasn't even close to enough. Their next game was an action RPG called Keef the Thief, a boy and his lockpick. And by the time it was finished, it had cost closer to $48,000 to make. Still cheap by today's standards, but a massive jump for two teenagers working out of their bedrooms. EA could absorb that though. Back then, games didn't need to sell millions of copies to turn a profit. If a game sold a few thousand units, it usually broke even. Keef the Thief launched in 1989, releasing on Apple II, Amiga, and MS-DOS. And this was a huge milestone. It was the first game released under the Naughty Dog name, a name inspired by Jason Rubin's dog, who lived with the team during the early years of game development. This is the part where I'm supposed to review Keef the Thief like I did with the previous two games. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not an RPG guy. I never really connected with the genre, and Keef the Thief is very far from being a beginner-friendly RPG. If you're an RPG fan or an 80s kid who grew up with games like this, I can totally see how this would be fun. But for me, a 2000s kid who mostly plays platformers and action-adventure games, playing this felt like being dropped into the cockpit of an airplane and being told to fly. I spent most of my time just doing things without fully understanding what was happening. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes I honestly had no idea whether it worked or not. I couldn't figure out what interactions were actually useful. I didn't really understand how combat was supposed to work, and I never felt confident about what winning or losing even meant in some encounters. I remember being confused the first time I played an RPG as a kid. It was one of the NES Final Fantasy games, though I don't even remember which one. But somehow, playing Keef the Thief left me even more confused than that. I think the first-person RPG perspective makes everything feel even more complex and less readable, especially if you're not already familiar with the genre. Just the way I'm talking about it makes it very obvious. This game is completely outside my comfort zone, so I genuinely hope that one day someone who really understands old-school RPGs gives this game the deep, thoughtful analysis it deserves. That said, I have to give credit where it's due. The soundtrack is absolutely god tier. I love the music in this game. Easily my favorite part of the experience. And honestly the thing I remember most fondly about it. Maybe one day, when I've expanded my taste and finally gotten into RPGs properly, I'll come back to Keef the Thief with fresh eyes. But for now, that's all I can say about the game itself. This game sold really well. Keef the Thief moved around 15,000 copies, which was massive for the time, and it made Gavin and Rubin a very healthy amount of money. But it also introduced them to something they hadn't really dealt with before: losing creative control. Originally, Keef the Thief was meant to be a more serious RPG. EA, however, pushed the game into a different direction. They wanted it to be funnier, and even brought in a comedy writer to help punch up the humor. That comedic angle also affected the marketing. The box art leaned cartoonish, which didn't quite match the game itself. And while the humor wasn't bad, the market just wasn't ready for a comedy RPG yet. And that stung, because Jason and Andy hadn't really had a say in that direction. Still, despite those frustrations, Keef the Thief was a turning point. They had landed a major publisher, shipped a large-scale RPG, sold tens of thousands of copies, and officially become Naughty Dog. Instead of walking away from EA, they doubled down. They immediately pitched EA another RPG, one that was much bigger and more ambitious. The project was codenamed Buccaneer, and they asked for $90,000 to make it. EA said yes. By the time it was done, it would cost $150,000, and that game would become Rings of Power. Development on what would eventually become Rings of Power started right after Keef the Thief wrapped up in 1989. At the time, the project was known internally as Buccaneer, and it was easily the most ambitious thing Naughty Dog had attempted so far. There was just one problem. Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin were now in college, and they were living in different states. Instead of slowing things down, they did something kinda ridiculous for the late 80s. They telecommuted. Long before remote work was normal, the two of them were sending code and assets back and forth using painfully slow modems. They were in two different universities far from each other, so this was literally the only way the game could get made during those games. When classes were out, they'd regroup, working out of Andy's parents' basement. Even then, development dragged on longer than expected. Buccaneer was originally planned as a 2-year project, but it ended up taking almost 3 years to finish. Another major curveball came from the platform itself. The game had originally been designed as a PC title, but partway through development, EA forced them to make it an exclusive for Sega's new console, the Genesis. This forced Naughty Dog to rethink huge parts of the game, while they were already deep into development. Things got even weirder when Jason and Andy visited EA and noticed something strange. Genesis consoles with ribbon cables sticking out of them, with monitors being turned off whenever someone walked by. EA was being extremely secretive. Eventually, Trip Hawkins himself let them on the truth. EA had reverse engineered the Genesis, and before officially working with Sega, they were using these hacked together development kits. Andy described them as Frankenstein machines, steel boxes with a Genesis grafted onto other boards, incredibly unstable and electrically noisy. So noisy in fact that when Andy turned one on in his place, TVs on the same electrical circuit would start glitching out. People would complain about their reception, not realizing it was the Genesis causing interference. Andy actually learned to use this interface as a debugging tool. When the noise pattern changed, it meant the hardware had crashed or was under heavy load. He'd leave a TV on across the room just to watch the static. Despite all of this, Rings of Power finally released on Sega Genesis in 1991. Once again, I'm going to skip pretending this is a traditional review, because when it comes to RPGs, my skill level is questionable at best. In Rings of Power, most combat encounters lasted for 10 seconds for me before I died. But honestly, this experience taught me a few important things. First, old PCs were brutal, both to play games on and to develop games for. Second, and more importantly, communication in RPGs is absolutely essential. With platformers, you can usually figure things out just by playing, but RPGs don't work like that. You can't just dump everything into a manual and assume players will absorb it. RPGs need to teach you how they work inside the game, unless they're extremely simple. And that's where my personal comparison comes in. I'm a Sonic fan, and at one point I decided to play every Sonic game. That means Sonic Chronicles is the only RPG that I've actually finished. Despite its reputation, I enjoyed it. Why? Because it was simple, I could understand it, and as a result I could finish it. And the Archie Sonic style world and characters kept me invested. That led me to a third realization. Even a bad RPG can be still enjoyable if it has strong world building and story that pulls you in. And unfortunately, that is something I personally didn't feel with Naughty Dog's RPG duo. I didn't connect with the world. I didn't feel motivated to push forward. And when the systems are already overwhelming, that lack of engagement makes it even harder to keep going. Rings of Power marked a huge turning point for Naughty Dog. This was their full transition from PC development to consoles, and after this, they would never go back to making computer games. Even Jason later admitted that the game probably should have stayed on PC, but the move to console defined their future. In terms of sales, the game actually did really well at first. Rings of Power sold through its entire initial print run of 100,000 copies in just 3 months. But then came the gut punch. The good news was that the game was sold out. The bad news? EA wasn't going to reprint it. The reason was brutally practical. Rings of Power used a large cartridge, included battery-backed save memory, and cost more to manufacture. EA had another game that was cheaper, easier to market, and guaranteed to sell. That game was Madden. Sport titles were exploding on the Genesis, and compared to Dragons, Magic Rings, and sprawling RPG systems, they were just an easier sell. EA's marketing and sales team were increasingly built around sports culture, and Naughty Dog's fantasy RPG didn't fit nearly into that world. Jason and Andy felt sidelined. Once again, they'd heard some version of, "It would be nice if this did better." This experience wore them down. After Keef the Thief and Rings of Power, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin were kinda done. They were proud of the games they made for EA, but they were also frustrated. They'd lost creative control, dealt with marketing people who didn't get their games, and watched solid projects get sidelined because something like Madden was cheaper and easier to sell. So weirdly enough, they decided to quit games altogether. At least for a bit. They were both about to graduate college. All of these games were made before they even had degrees. Jason headed to California, saying he wanted to learn how to surf. Andy went to MIT, planning to chase a PhD. Neither plan really worked out the way they expected. Jason never even bought a surfboard. Instead, he accidentally fell into 3D graphics and started a small special effects company. This was early 90s 3D. Insanely expensive stuff. The computers and software could cost $75,000 or more. Jason landed a legit movie contract from Columbia Pictures to work on Wolf, the Jack Nicholson movie, specifically a morphing shot. And right as he was about to start, the phone rang. On the other end was Trip Hawkins. Yes, the founder of EA, Trip Hawkins. And now the guy behind the 3DO, a brand new CD-based console that was supposed to change everything. Hawkins pitched it as a dream machine. CDs instead of cartridges, massive storage, cheaper manufacturing, and more. And all he asked was, "Hey, want to check out a new dev kit? No strings." Jason and Andy said yes. They hated cartridges. They hated how expensive they were to make, how conservative publishers had to be with the print runs, and how games could die just because manufacturing costs were too high. CDs fixed all of that. They were cheap, fast to print, and low risk. So Naughty Dog jumped in, without a publisher. They funded the game themselves, using almost every dollar they had left from Rings of Power. Total budget $80,000. This time they were done with 300-page design documents and publisher approval meetings. They wanted to design on the fly, make something fast, make something fun, make something that fit the market right now. And in 1993, the hottest genre on the planet was fighting games. Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Samurai Showdown, they were everywhere. So Naughty Dog decided to make a fighting game for the 3DO. The game became Way of the Warrior. The logic was simple. Fighting games were a great bang for the buck. You only ever see two characters on screen. Pour all your resources into animations, moves, and impact, and you've got something playable fast. They leaned heavily into Mortal Kombat for inspiration. Digitized characters, over-the-top violence, and a slightly goofy tone inspired by kung fu movies they loved. To make it work, they had to be in the same place again. Jason tried to lure Andy into California, but Andy convinced Jason to move to Boston, where Andy was still at MIT. They rented a pretty terrible apartment and turned it into a makeshift studio. They couldn't afford a proper blue screen, so they bought a tan-colored screen, nailed it to the wall, and covered the windows and air vents. To film properly, Jason literally had to stand in the hallway with the front door open, which understandably confused their MIT and Harvard neighbors. For the first time ever, the game got too big for the just two of them. They hired contractors to help with the insane task of manually cutting out digitized characters pixel by pixel. This was the last time Naughty Dog would ever be a two-person operation. The cast was equally ridiculous. Every character was a friend, family member, or random academic. Costumes were pure desperation. Pillowcases, bed sheets, a jewel taken from a second-hand Princess Jasmine costume. By the end of the development, they were flat broke. Jason had $6 in his bank account. They lived on ramen noodles. Their apartment was so full of dog hair, it barely looked like carpet anymore. They went all in. With no publisher, they spent their last real money on a 9 square foot booth at CES 1994. Just enough space to show the game and hope someone noticed, and it worked. This is the part I should review the game, but since I'm not a fighting game player either, I will just say it is a Mortal Kombat clone. Is it a good clone or a bad one? I have no idea. A fighting game player should review it. A bidding war broke out. 3 companies wanted Way of the Warrior: 3DO, Crystal Dynamics, and Universal. Crystal Dynamics almost took it until Naughty Dog realized they mostly wanted the game engine to force them to work on Samurai Showdown. Trip Hawkins tried hard to convince them to go exclusive with 3DO, but Universal Interactive made a better offer: funding, creative freedom, and chance to make a new game on their own terms. They chose Universal. Looking back, Jason and Andy both said this was one of the most important decisions they've ever made. Going exclusive with 3DO could have ended the studio. Instead, they packed up, drove to California, and started brainstorming ideas for what came next. On that road trip, they came up with a new character, a new genre, a new future. That idea became Crash Bandicoot, and that's where the Naughty Dog story truly explodes. Now let's do a ranking of all the 6 games I've talked about, and note that this ranking is completely subjective. At number 6 I have Math Jam because it is a lost media, I cannot play it, so by default it becomes the worst. At number 4 I have Rings of Power because I just kept doing in it and I had no idea what to do in it. Then at number 4 I have Keef the Thief because at least in this one I could win a few combat encounters. Then at number 3 I have Way of the Warrior because at least in a fighting game I can win by mashing buttons, and also it's ridiculous in a way that I love it. At number 2 I have Dream Zone because there was some parts of it that I really enjoyed the vibe, and also I like the music sometimes. And at number 1 I have Crazed because of its simplicity. This was the only game that I could almost finish it, and yeah, because of its simplicity I think I enjoyed this one the most. So as you realized, I wasn't really a big fan of these games. They were kinda a pain in the head. But despite that, I don't believe that they deserve to be forgotten. After all, if it wasn't for these games, we could never have Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, The Last of Us. Naughty Dog couldn't have become what it is today if it wasn't for these games. So because of that, even though I don't even like these games, I have nothing but respect for them. So I think that a collection of these 6 games need to exist so that people would remember where truly did Naughty Dog come from. So at this point, Naughty Dog had done everything the hard way. They had made games on the Apple II with no internet. They called EA as teenagers and somehow landed a deal. They survived losing creative control, switching platforms mid-development, and watching their game get shelved for Madden. They had quit the industry, come back, bet their entire savings on a fighting game, lived on ramen noodles, and sold it out of a 9 square foot CES booth. And somehow they were still standing. More importantly, they had learned exactly what not to do. They knew what they wanted. Full creative control, a single focused platform, no cartridges, no bloated design dogs, and a game that showed off hardware instead of fighting it. Universal gave them that chance. So Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin moved to California and decided to do something completely insane for the mid-90s. Make a fully 3D platformer on a brand new hardware and make it as tight and precise as a 2D game. No safety net, no precedent, no roadmap, just two developers who'd spent a decade learning how to squeeze blood from a stone. The result wasn't just Naughty Dog's breakout hit, it was the game that defined the original PlayStation. Next time, we're finally spinning into it. Crash Bandicoot. How Naughty Dog went from broke indie developers to one of the most important studios in gaming history.